So, I will hand over now to our new session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's third and final panel session at the inaugural symposium. I'm Summary Sheriff Amel Elfallah. I sit at Glasgow Sheriff Court. Before becoming a Summary Sheriff, I worked in the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service for nearly 20 years, where I dealt with criminal cases at summary, solemn and appellate level. I joined the Scottish Sentencing Council as a judicial member in July of last year, and I'm the chair of its Communications Committee, which means I do a lot of talking, but hopefully not today. I'm going to rely on my two distinguished panel members to do most of the talking. I'll get to them shortly. This session is on the important topic of community sentencing and rehabilitation. As Lord Matthews mentioned earlier, this has been an area of focus for the Council. We've done a lot of work on it. We've undertaken extensive research with sentencers on identifying any gaps or barriers to the provision of community-based disposals and to understanding what might improve judicial confidence in community-based interventions. We've published the findings of that particular exercise in an issues paper called Judicial Perspectives of Community-Based Disposals. That was published in 2021. It is available on our website. We followed up on that by holding a conference last year with members of the judiciary, lawyers, social workers, victims groups, police, academics and third sector organisations. And that was exploring the use of and confidence in community disposals. And again, a report about that event is also available on the Council's website. And we've also sought to improve public knowledge around community sentences and what they involve. As part of this, we have made a few videos, and on that front, we have a real treat for you today. Today is the world premiere, I'm talking exclusive, reveal of our video on, our public information video on community sentences, which I am now, brace yourselves, going to play for you. So bear with me a moment, here we go.
A prison sentence will always be appropriate for the most serious offences. For other offences, a community sentence may be appropriate. The Scottish Sentencing Council commissioned this video to hear what people with knowledge of the justice system had to say about the community sentences handed down in Scottish courts. The views expressed are not necessarily those of the Council. The voice and words of the person sentenced to the community payback order are his own. However, the person shown in the video is an actor.
When I received my community payback order, it was a kind of mixture of feelings. There was relief, and then there was also like the feeling of being given a chance to actually repent for your crimes.
A judge decides a sentence by considering a lot of different factors. The aim is that the sentence is fair and proportionate. The first step always is to assess the seriousness of the offence by considering the culpability, the blameworthiness of the offender and the harm that was caused. That will involve considering the victim. The more harm that crime causes, the greater the sentence will be.
As a young reporter, I would go into the courts, and as you spend time in the courts, you start to see people coming through with different problems. They've possibly committed crimes because of those problems. They go to prison, they come out, they commit another crime, go back into prison, and clearly it's not working. Community sentencing, in my opinion, is absolutely essential. Without helping people, without breaking the cycle that they've got themselves into, they're just going to commit more crime.
Community sentences can be a real opportunity to address the issues that lie behind people's offending behaviour. And the benefit is that process of rehabilitation can take place without the disruption that's caused by imprisonment.
I think prison would have impacted me quite a lot, because when I was sent to prison, it was only for a 6-month sentence and I got put into Glenorchy jail when I was sitting with people that was doing 30 years for murder, and then they try to pass stuff on to you.
Community sentences can sometimes be seen as a soft touch, and I think that is fueled by the media to an extent. There's still a perception that prison is the be-all and end-all as punishment, and that's where criminals deserve to be.
Most of us don't find supervision an easy experience. When people are in authority over us, we find that difficult. So imagine that the person in charge of you and supervising you can effectively bring you back to court and maybe put you in prison. Imagine that they're entitled to come into your family home, and that might mean contact with family members, which you would find shameful or embarrassing. And perhaps most importantly, they leave you in a kind of limbo position where you are left wondering whether you're going to get to the end of this without breaching the order and finding yourself back in court and maybe in a worse situation. So really, until you get to the last day and know that you've completed every requirement, you're not free, you're not finished. That is not walking free from anything. That's walking out of court, but it's walking out of court into a difficult and challenging situation which is likely to endure for a considerable length of time.
Community sentences can include unpaid work to benefit the community, supervision to address offending behaviour, an electronic tag or curfew, compensation to a victim, programmes for drug, alcohol or mental health issues.
Maybe if I'd got the jail, maybe wouldn't have tried to have changed it. It could have went either way. But maybe having that chance in the community to pay back that way. Some days it would be cutting elderly people's grass. It'd maybe be helping out painting schools.
I've been a victim of crime, both violent crime and property crime. And what I wanted was that the person who harmed me was brought to account, but also that it didn't happen to me again and it didn't happen to anyone else. And therefore, those individuals who commit crime need to change their behaviour, and that's what community sentences are designed to help them to do. There are a whole variety of programmes, and they address the individual's particular issues. They need to be properly resourced, of course. Most victims would support interventions that stop people from committing crimes. I think for those who don't require to be kept away from the public for safety reasons, community sentences provide a really useful option to focus on individuals and on why they've committed the offences and what is needed to make sure they don't offend again.
A very large proportion of people that go through the criminal justice system are offending because there's some relationship between drug and alcohol problems and offending behaviour. Sometimes that's to do with people committing crimes to raise money to buy drugs, or sometimes it's to do with people behaving in particular ways when they're intoxicated. It's unlikely that those behaviours are going to be addressed unless the drug problem's addressed. And so a judge or sheriff might decide to impose a treatment condition so that the process of recovery from the substance use problem hopefully also helps move a person towards desistance from crime.
The supervision put me in contact with addiction workers and stuff like that. It's given me a better outlook on stuff.
In general, when we look at the reconviction rates for community sentences versus short prison sentences, in almost every study, in almost every country, there is a lower reconviction rate for community sentences than for short prison sentences.
I think it was last chance saloon for me. I've got a couple of children, so it gave me the chance to pay back without having to go to prison. I think the impact that I had on me was knowing that I was able to help people. I've not got into any more trouble since.
To find out more, you can visit us at scottishsentencingcouncil.org.uk or email us at sentencingcouncil@scottcourts.gov.uk.
That will be coming to the Scottish Sentencing Council's website in due course. Release dates will be forthcoming. So, I'm sure you're all wondering, how do we follow that? Well, the answer is with a legend from the researching community. Professor Cyrus Tata needs no introduction, which is just as well, because he told me I wasn't allowed to give him one. His details are many and storied, and they're all in the pack if you want to read more about him, but he's going to be talking to us today about public confidence in sentencing. Professor Tata.
Thanks so much, Sheriff Elfallah. How do you follow that? Well, I rather enjoyed that. I think that's, to those responsible, well done. Starring role there. You've got you've already got a music career. I think you've got a future in film as well. It's everything. And it was also great. Obviously people with lived experience. It was also great to see someone like Sue Moody talking as a victim. I think that's so important. You also had that perspective in there. Really, really, really important. I'm going to talk briefly, and I know, and I include this for students who are here from our Masters in Criminal Justice and Penal Change, will be surprised to hear these words, but I'm going to try to speak briefly. It doesn't often happen. And really make one simple point, and the point is about the need for, that we have an opportunity and we have a piece in the jigsaw, which if we can find that piece, then we can make some real we have the chance to make some real improvements, not to fix everything, but to make some real improvements in terms of public confidence, particularly in terms of community sentencing, to follow up the video and the title of this panel. And as many of you who work in the field and study it will know, sentencing, criminal justice generally, but sentencing often looks and feels a little bit like this. A kind of sitting duck target that is very easy to shoot down and to find and to criticise. And one can easily, whether one in sections of the media, sections of politics, or whatever, make considerable capital from doing so. And when that happens, and especially when there is a high-profile case, something terrible has happened, or something appears to have gone wrong, there can be one of two responses prior to the advent of the likes of a sentencing council or similar body. And the two possible strategic responses consist of these, I think. The first one on the right there, to essentially say, well, what does the public know? What do these ill-informed media commentators know? And what do politicians know about what's going on? Really nothing. And they're talking absolute nonsense. And we have to maintain our independence, and none more so rightly than judicial sentences, but everyone in the system should do that when they're dealing with their individual cases. They have to maintain their independence. And we just hope it will go away, and then we carry on doing what we're doing. Of course, the problem with that collectively, as a collective body, whether it's the judiciary or the prosecution or social work or whatever, is that sooner or later, those politicians and media and so forth will make capital from saying, well, we need to restrict the discretion and the freedom and the autonomy of those groups. The alternative strategy prior to the advent of a council was the kind of headless chicken strategy, to go around kind of go, oh my goodness, something terrible has happened, it must be your fault or their fault, it wasn't us, it was somebody else, the headless chicken kind of routine. And I think it's such a marvellous thing in this wonderful and this wonderful conference illustrates it very well, that we have now a council to think strategically and in a long-term way about how do we go about trying to improve public confidence. Just to remind you, as Lord Matthews, who opened our conference, reminded us the council has 3 statutory objectives. It must, not may, it must promote consistency in sentencing. It must assist in the development of policy, and it must promote greater public awareness and understanding. The second one's probably in some ways the easiest nut to crack in certain respects, the development of policy, the development of guidelines, and I think the Council's been doing some really great and some interesting work around that, not least, for instance, the guideline on young people, which was mentioned earlier. But I think the first one and the third one really are in need of something, and that is data about current patterns of sentencing. We have some information about this, some good quality data, and as Nicole rightly said, there is some there from SCTS and the criminal proceedings, but as she also alluded to, there are also gaps in that data, and we really need to know far more. And as I'll try to just explain briefly, if we have that available to us, we have a chance to make some real advances in public confidence. But at the moment, the data that we've got is sometimes good, but often lacking in terms of really looking at the seriousness of different kinds of cases. There really isn't a lot there that we can do. And I'll try to illustrate that very briefly with some work that we've been doing. And just to talk a little bit, just to let you know about, I'm drawing on a few sources of research that I've been involved in recent years. Public attitudes research, for instance, the Ipsos research that Lord Matthews mentioned at the start of the conference. I was involved with that. We did a nationally representative survey, also qualitative work, also looking at public attitudes in terms of death by driving cases, and also the experience of bereaved families, which was powerful to listen to. Sexual offences, which, and this has been done with colleagues, for instance, Rachel McPherson, who's here in the room, looking at public and, again, victim survivor experiences, and other things such as sentence discounting, mitigation, and remorse. And recently working with the Judicial Council in Ireland to look at the data that they have. And the Judicial Council, the SGIC, the Sentencing Guidelines and Information Committee, essentially an equivalent body to a sentencing council there, has been very candid under the leadership of Judge O'Malley in acknowledging that they really don't have the data that they need, and they really need to improve that. So we'll be looking at that with them. Okay. Would it be okay, because you've sat through it's been warm in this room, it's either been warm or the fan's been going off, to ask for a little bit of audience participation? Would that be okay? Now, you're hardly a representative sample, you're highly expert, but I'm just going to ask you, we asked people, for instance, in our Ipsos work about confidence in criminal justice generally. So I'm just going to show you a couple of little highlights from some of the research that we've been doing. There's no time to go into all of it. We asked people about confidence, and what would be your guess, if you'd hazard a guess, about people who said that the percentage of people who said they were not very confident or not confident at all that the criminal justice system was fair to all? And what would be your guess about sort of percentage that might say they were either very confident or fairly confident? Who's going to have a go? I'm not going to say.
70% not confident.
70% not confident, Lindsay.
Higher.
Higher. Anyone else? Higher? Do you remember that? Higher, lower?
I'm flipping it lower.
Going lower. Go on. 50, go and phone up 50-50, throw in a frame.
I'll give you 30%.
Give you 30. So, it looked like this. Could be worse. Could be worse, Lindsay. It could be worse. So, this is the criminal justice system overall. Asking people about, first of all asked them about that overall. So, either very confident or fairly confident, 63%. Not very confident, 23%. So over a third either not very confident or not confident at all. 12%, which should worry us. Not confident at all. That's fair to all. Now, that varies hugely by demography, and this point is replicated in other countries. And one of the demographic features that it varies by is levels of education. And I've simplified this a lot. I've left out the don't knows if you wonder why it doesn't add up to 100%. Essentially, people with higher qualifications, like you, tend to have much greater confidence in the system and in its fairness to all than people with no qualifications. I wonder what you make of the implication of that, what that might mean. Anyone want to hazard?
their
thought.
experiences of the justice system.
That's interesting. Yes, go on.
Less likely to have been on the receiving end of
Right.
the sentence.
So that's very interesting. You both are suggesting that it might be to do with experiences. The other thing that people sometimes would say, and that people like me in their ivory towers could be tempted to say, is, well, there you go, you see. People who are more educated, who are more knowledgeable, are more confident. They understand the reality. But that may be true, but it may also be the case that people who tend to have lower levels of qualification, lower socioeconomic groups, might get a rougher deal, or might know people who have got a rougher deal. So both of those could be true. Anyway, let us move on a little bit more. We asked people about principles and support for different kinds of principles, and we asked them about in general terms and also in terms of young people. And you can see, for instance, rehabilitation, which is very pertinent to community-based penalties. In general terms, around a quarter saying that, but one can make the argument also in terms of protecting the public, I think, in terms of community-based penalties, as the argument was made to some extent in the world premiered movie there. But very strong in terms of young people. So a degree of support there for instance, the guideline judgment that was on young people. But what about sentencing in particular? We asked people, do you think sentencing severity is a very general question? When we then got into much more depth, but do you think sentencing is about right in terms of its severity? Do you think it's too tough, too lenient? What sort of percentage do you reckon? About right. Hazard a guess. 20% about right. Any other thoughts? Anyone going to go higher or lower than Liz?
I'll go about 40.
You're going to go for, okay, going to go 40. Okay. About right, less than a third. A little too lenient or much too lenient, 56%. Much too tough or a little too tough, that'll be the penal reformers amongst us, 3%. And don't know or refuse to say. So, it won't surprise you, a pervasive sense of leniency. However, there's more to say about that. We also asked people about how much knowledge do you think you've got about sentencing. Having, on the one hand, strong views about what ought to be done, people also were quite candid in admitting that they either know only a little or nothing at all, totaling 53%, about sentencing. Nothing at all. 8%. Nothing. Well, that should worry us if we want to improve public confidence. And only 42% moderate around, and 5% among people in this room and others know a lot about it. So what's the solution? And this is really my simple point I would like to make at the end of a fascinating but longish day. What is the solution? What do we do about this? I think you need 3 things, and we have 2 of them at present, or we can have 2 of them, but we need to develop the 3rd. You need to know about people's preference, and this work has been done in other countries. We need to know about people's preferred kinds of sentences for different kinds of cases, not just in general terms, giving them a scenario, giving them a bit of detail. You can add in further information and see how that changes people's views and so forth. Find out about their preferences for particular kinds of cases, whether it be death by driving cases, sexual offence cases, whatever, different specific kinds of scenarios, not just the charge, but actually going into different types of cases with different offender characteristics and so on. What sorts of sentence do they think the courts normally pass for this kind of case? So we say, what would you like to see passed? What do you think normally happens? And then ask them, what do you think actually happens? What do you think the courts actually do? Now, where this has been done in other countries, and to a limited extent in Scotland, we've been able to show this, that actually what people would like to see happen, their preferred sentence, in certain kinds of cases, they will give an answer, and then you ask them, what do you think normally happens? They will say it's much more lenient than it is. Where we have the data to show that actually you've overestimated leniency, often by a huge margin, then you can show that and you can say to people, well, actually, this is the reality of what happens in these kinds of cases. The problem that we have is that very often we simply weren't able to say, here's what the normal sentencing patterns are. I know we can all guess. All of us can guess, and those of you who actually do the job of sentencing, obviously you have to do that. But inevitably, that's not the same as having systematic data about the patterns that you can be really sure about. And you need that also to be able to know whether or not guidelines are having an impact, to know whether or not you're achieving greater consistency over time and so forth, to fulfill the statutory functions. So you need those three things. And that third tranche of information, what really happens in practice, is quite limited at the moment. I know that the Scottish Sentencing Council is really trying to improve that. And it doesn't have to be a hugely necessarily expensive exercise to do that. So just to explain this very briefly and illustrate it, we were looking at this, for instance, in I think in sexual offence cases, death by driving cases and so on. And we had to come up with a formula to explain that we didn't really have the information about what really goes on typically in reality. We came up with this formula, which I think Sir Humphrey, those of you who remember, yes, Minister, would have been proud of. Likely sentences for these specific scenarios have been agreed based upon sentencing data, where available, i.e. quite often not available, and the professional experience of the report authors, people like me, their consultants, members of the Scottish Sentencing Council and the Council Secretariat, all of whom are, of course, incredibly knowledgeable, maybe not me, but the others are, but it's not the same thing as systematic data that you can be absolutely sure about. However, the likely sentences should not be viewed as confirming how these or similar offences would, in fact, be dealt with. So very often we simply don't have the data. And that's what we need. And if you had those three things, you've got the potential to make some real headway, to be able to say, we know this is what you would prefer. You imagine the courts are passing this kind of sentence. So, for instance, people sometimes imagine the courts are passing non-custodial sentences for rape and robbery. Simply wrong. You imagine this is what's happening. And here in this kind of scenario, it's the kind of sentencing patterns we do see. And where you've got that, you can tell a really powerful story. And people are really quite surprised and quite pleased to hear, oh, it's not as lenient as we thought. But you need that data. So that's really what I wanted to say, is you need those three things. We've got two. The third doesn't have to be hugely expensive. There are different ways of doing that, but we could talk about that during the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Tata, for that. Lots of food for thought there. And I'm sure there'll be some questions about that later on. Before we do that, though, can I introduce the second speaker in our panel, star not only of the academic community, but also of our own video. We're grateful he's taken time out from fielding calls from Hollywood to grace us with his expertise. So, Professor Fergus McNeill, again, his details in the bio, again, very distinguished, and we're very lucky to have him here. He's going to be talking to us today about the pains and gains of community sentencing. Professor, thank you.
Very pleased to be here and to have the invitation. I've had many careers. There are actually people in the room who would have received social inquiry reports from me in the 1990s. I won't name them for fear that they remember what those reports were like. But just a brief behind-the-scenes insight into the filming process. You're probably wondering, how did a novice actor manage to write on a whiteboard or to walk through a door with that level of conviction? And I can now reveal I was using the Joey Tribbiani method. I was actually in a lot of pain and I had stopped taking the pain medication. I had a shoulder problem at the time. The reason I'm holding my arm so intensely in those shots is because my shoulder was really sore. I'd stopped taking the pain medication to have a clear head to answer the questions reasonably intelligently, but the effect of that was to give that gravitas that you probably admired. So anyway, to get to the topic, the pains, fittingly, and the gains of community sentences. Well, I realised actually as I looked at the presentation today that I had missed an important slide which would have given us a bit of historical and statistical context for what I'm going to say. But fortunately, in my bag, I found this book, Pervasive Punishment, which was published a few years ago and has lots of data in it, and a long story about the history of attempts in Scotland to promote the use of community sentences and to reduce the use of custody. And that history lasts at least 125 years. Cutting it very short, in 1931 we created probation services in Scotland. In the late 1960s we abandoned them, bringing those functions within the newly established generic social work departments in the local authorities. By the end of the 1970s, courts had lost confidence in probation, and to be honest, they'd never had it. The numbers had been low most of the 20th century. The Scottish Office was very frustrated. There were lots of initiatives, really from the start of the century when it was in local pilot sites, right through the century, attempts to encourage judges, sheriffs to use custody less. So we get to 1980, and here come the numbers, and I'm sorry I don't have graphs to demonstrate this, but these are quite important numbers. In 1980, we had 2,739 probation orders in Scotland. That was all. Around that time, we had about 5,000 people in prison. So a total population under the control of what the Americans would call the correctional system of just under 8,000 people. So the 1980s, those of us that lived through it remember it as the decade of prison riots, overcrowding, dreadful conditions, very high rates of suicide, hostage takings of prison staff, major political controversy, and as a result we get Scottish Office, initially, investment in the promotion of community sentences. And here's the apparent good news. By 2015, the number of community sentences rises from that figure of under 3,000 to 19,000. 19,000 community payback orders by that time in 2015. So a huge expansion. And it's even, well, no, I'm not going to say that yet. I'm going to hold that little fact back for a moment. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that over the same period, the prison population rises from 5,000 to 8,000, so that by 2015, we actually have about 30,000 people. That includes a few, well, 2,000 or so that are subject to post-release supervision. So we now have a correctional system of 30,000 people, not less than 8,000 people. And we've achieved it through a huge success in the expansion of community sentences, but with a complete failure to reduce our use of custody, leading my colleague Sarah Armstrong once to pithily observe that Scotland had become the Texas of Europe. And she was right. European statistics published a few years ago had Scotland very highly ranked across the continent as having one of the largest correctional populations in the continent. So that's the numerical context that helps us understand why taking the pains of community sentences seriously is tremendously important. If we think, and we've thought it for decades in Scotland, that we're doing people a favour by imposing community sentences, that we're exercising mercy or leniency, or that we're going to make their lives better by doing nice things to them because social workers are nice people, I know I was one, we're wrong. These sentences involve suffering. And I want to talk about the suffering first, to drive home the point that the imposition of community sentences, like any other sentence, has to be guided by considerations of limiting retributivism, of proportionality and parsimony. So, to drive this message home, actually, part of the process of discovering these pains came through a European project. A few people in the room were involved with this, that ran for 4 years between 2012 and 2016. We gathered academics and a few others across the European continent. We had 23 countries, over 50 or 60 people involved, and we had working groups in different areas trying to enhance the quality of and capacity for research on supervision in Europe across the continent. One group looked at how supervision was experienced by people subject to it. And actually, one of the places that we started was with the observation that community sentences are largely invisible. If I ask you, and I do this with my students in the room next door every time I teach the course of the book, close your eyes for a moment. You can do this, you can trust me. It's 3:10 on a Friday. You're in prison. Where do you see yourself? What do you imagine happening? Something will be happening in your brain, right? At the moment you are able to visualize something. You might be visualizing a treatment room, a work party, a cell, a dining hall, but there's something in your imagination. If I do the same exercise, 3:10 on a Friday, close your eyes, you're on probation, imagine it. Nothing happens to most people. Nothing. There's nothing conjured in the imagination by that. Or, more technically, if I say you're on a CPO, there's nothing there. In England, I say you're on a suspended sentence order. What? Nobody knows what to imagine. And so we had I thought, rather good idea of asking people subject to supervision to help us visualize it by taking pictures that represented it. And then we used those pictures to discuss their experiences of and feelings about community sentences. I don't have time to go into the methodological detail. We did this in 3 countries with somewhat different populations. There's a Scottish subset of the data. It's small scale and it's a pilot study. These are all pictures from Scottish supervisees. And each of them comes with a quote that explains their meaning. Again, if this was my pervasive punishment class, you would get the picture, a few minutes to try to interpret it, and then I would give you the quote. But I can tell you, for the sake of time, top left is a picture about what it feels like to be left hanging by the kind of suspended threat of potential imprisonment that comes with a community sentence in many cases. Top right is a cunning representation of both a social worker and a supervisee trapped in the complex web of criminal justice. The supervisor is the elevated one, and the supervisee is the lower or degraded one. And the last 2 images are interesting. The bottom left image looks like a gallows to me, but there's an eye in it, an all-seeing eye, and enough light maybe to suggest some hope. Bottom right is the half-open door of the Botanic Gardens in Glasgow, which the photographer says is what it's like to be on supervision, neither free, nor constrained, or nor locked up. The door's half open, or is it half shut, he said. So, more generally, when we analysed the images, we found that people talked, or we discerned at least 4 or 5 key themes, and these are ambivalent. They're neither good nor bad, they're both at the same time. So people felt constrained by community sentences in important ways. They experienced them as constraining, but sometimes to be constrained is to be held safely. A hug is a constraint. The thing is, you can usually get out of it if you want. So constraint can be felt positively and negatively by people subject to it, but mainly negatively. There's a sense of time being lost or suspended. That's generally experienced as painful, but it can also mean time out from a chaotic life which needs some kind of order imposed on it. So there's a positive spin in some cases on the suspension of time. Waste sounds negative and usually meant people felt like they were the waste of society and they were being processed as such. But as 1 or 2 also pithily observed, excuse my language, supervision was also a way to deal with your own shit. So you could process your waste, deal with the mess of your life with the support of somebody supervising you in a humane way. So again, ambivalence. Growth and hope was the most positive theme, but our supervisees were, of course, smart enough to recognise that growth is painful, even if it's something that we might desire, and hope can be painful too, obviously. The one theme which only travels in one direction is the feeling of being judged and stigmatised, the feeling of being degraded by being regarded as somebody who needs to be subject to supervision. And that was a very widespread theme which had no ambivalence in it. Now, both the numbers, which show the massive expansion, it's not Scottish alone, it's happened in North America, where at the peak 5 million people were on probation or parole, just as 2.5 million were incarcerated. In Europe, there are roughly 3 times as many people subject to community sanctions as there are people subject to imprisonment, and the same problem of growth without diversion. Okay, so that's a widespread problem, and it leads the European group that I chaired to come to this conclusion. We need to reform mass supervision, as we've called it, recognising it hurts when we make decisions about imposing it or revoking it. Those decisions have to be bound by considerations of proportionality. No one should be subject to more demanding or intrusive supervision than their offending deserves. Supervision must be delivered in ways that actively minimise unintended and unnecessary pains, both for those subject to it and for others affected by it, what some people call secondary supervision and others call symbiotic harms. So, how do we do that? Well, first of all, what does the principle of parsimony look like applied to supervision? Well, it's a principle that limits punishment at its imposition. We could have a no unnecessary order principle. We could say there should be no unnecessary curtailment of liberty, no unnecessary restriction of autonomy, no unnecessary invasion of privacy, no unnecessary disqualification from the rights of ordinary citizenship, and therefore no unnecessary interference with any other human rights. We might also say that to keep it small, to keep the pain as limited as possible, we have to make sure that the punishment ends. And this is something which applies to all kinds of punishment, in my view. If I were a German judge, I would know that the Constitutional Court holds that reintegration is the purpose of punishment, the defining purpose. So a punishment which doesn't end and doesn't bring a person into a place of social integration is a failed punishment. I wish we had that principle so explicit in our legal systems in the UK. But part of our obligation, and this may not be an obligation for judges or sheriffs, this is more to do with other actors in the system, part of our obligation is to make it end, to assert a positive right to reintegration through and beyond supervision, which requires access to services and timely access to legal requalification, more of which in a moment. Linked to parsimony, of course, is proportionality, and here we could think about, and I'm sure Scottish judges and sheriffs do think about, what is the appropriate length of time for a supervision order. Some of the numbers you would get on this in the States are terrifying. There are people in America on probation for 20 years. I'll give you a case, actually. I can't resist this case. I heard this last week in Philadelphia. A woman in New York who was sentenced to 10 years on probation and had small children was struggling with the weekly appointment that she had to attend across the city. She couldn't get childcare. She had run out of favours from her mother, her grandmother, her aunts, her sisters. So she went back to court and asked to be sent to Rikers Island, because at least that way she could get the whole thing dealt with and out of the way. Rikers Island. And that's what the judge did. Acceded to her request. So think about the length of time. Think about the depth of supervision's interference with autonomy. Condition loading is the jargon that criminologists use here. How many conditions are we imposing? Is there a case for every single one? A case that is bound by considerations of proportionality? Or am I overstepping here because I want something good to happen for this person? So, for example, am I imposing a treatment requirement because it's within the constraint of what a proportionate penalty will be, or am I doing it because I think it will do some good to the person in front of me? I would argue, if it's the latter, well, it's not for me to tell judges what to do, but if it's the latter, that person should have access to that service through another route which is voluntary. And we should never impose a mandatory requirement to do something that isn't justified with respect to proportionality. So think about the depth of the interference with autonomy, think about the weight of the burdens that are being created, think about the tightness of control and how that's experienced, think about the degradations of supervisee status, and listen to the lived experience in doing that. So finally, to get round to the happy stuff, if we attend to the questions of parsimony and proportionality, then within the envelope that those considerations create, we can start having a conversation about how to make supervision productive. And that is largely a question about rehabilitation and how to do it. I would argue, though, before we get into the technicalities of evidence-based practice, we need normative principles here too, about the dignity of supervised persons, about a commitment to the development of their potential and their capacity, but also about the importance of advocacy for access to opportunities if they are to be reintegrated. In the administration of the sentence, we have to attend to questions of fairness and procedural justice, and that attends as much to adults as it does to young people, although we have extra reasons to attend to it in relation to young people, as we heard earlier. And more generally, I think the principle of maximising the degree of voluntarism is an important one. So my last slide is just to unpack, lastly, this concept of reintegration. You'll be glad to know, the Scots among you, that when I go and give talks, as I do in many different places around the world about rehabilitation, I always introduce them to the Scottish word thankle. And you can see why, right? The concept of rehabilitation is a thankle. Meaning, for those of you not in the know, a tangle, but also a person can be in a thankle. You know, my mum used to say, enough. Don't want to know about that. So, a state of confusion, a kind of mental disarray. And I think rehabilitation is that kind of messy concept. When we use the word mostly in the Anglophone world, we mean something like correctional rehabilitation. We mean doing something with or to the individual that helps them address their behaviour and live better afterwards. If we were in France in the 16th or 17th century, we would be saying a person should be rétablir dans ses droits. To be restored in your rights is the meaning of rehabilitation, which speaks to the question of reintegration and civic and legal status in an obvious way. Moral rehabilitation is quite separate from the question of whether an individual addresses their problems and changes. It's to do with the relationship with the victim. It's to do with whether you can deal with something which discredits you as a moral agent and allows you back into a community on terms of parity. That's to do with reconciliation. It's to do with restoration. It's to do with reparative efforts. And lastly, and most importantly, I would argue, we can't talk about rehabilitation without talking about social reaction. You can't rehabilitate yourself. You can't reintegrate yourself. And indeed, the state can't reintegrate you. If the state could reintegrate you, you'd be living in a totalitarian dystopia. You can only be reintegrated by your family, your community, your neighbours, people in your faith community, people in your political party, the people in your bowling club. These are not very likely sources of high volume criminal justice processing, perhaps, but you know what I'm saying. Social rehabilitation is about acceptance and belonging within the community, and it can be facilitated by the state distributing resources to communities to enable them to be reintegrative, and it can be facilitated by the state telling its actors to pursue all of these forms of rehabilitation simultaneously. But it can't ultimately be done by the state, certainly not acting alone. So there are potential gains in community sentences, as I made obvious in the film. I think there's a place for them I think they can and should displace custodial sentences wherever that is possible and justifiable, but I think we also have to be extremely thoughtful and cautious about the risks of net widening, about the risks of subjecting people to greater degrees of interference in their lives than their offending merits. And I think in Scotland we've been very careless about that over the course of several decades, maybe because we have a system where we expect social workers to do this job and we assume that they'll be doing that with welfare as their principal concern. I'll stop there.
Thank you. It is now time for the final session of the day. I'd like to welcome Gavin Dingwall, who is the Head of Policy and Communications at the Sentencing Academy, to the podium to deliver the closing remarks. Again, Gavin is a very important and distinguished individual who's